This is a Pakistani rupee. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's face, that pale green ink, the promise of value printed in Urdu script. Last year, this bought goods worth about half a cent. This morning, it buys goods worth a quarter cent. By the time the Chinese debt comes due, $62 billion over the next 18 months, it might buy nothing at all. Pakistan is dying in plain sight. The currency has collapsed 78% in 3 years. Inflation is running at 38% officially, closer to 60% in the markets where ordinary Pakistanis actually buy food. Electricity blackouts run 12 hours daily in summer. The government is functionally bankrupt, paying interest on debt with new debt, trapped in a spiral that has only one exit. That exit leads through Beijing. And Beijing is not offering charity. 3 days ago, China's Ministry of Finance delivered a proposal to Islamabad that Pakistani officials are calling the Comprehensive Debt Resolution Framework. The document runs 234 pages. I've obtained a copy through a source in Pakistan's Ministry of Finance, who believes his country is about to be colonized through contracts rather than conquest. The framework doesn't forgive Pakistan's debt. It converts the debt into something far more valuable to China: permanent control over Pakistani infrastructure, Pakistani territory, and Pakistani sovereignty. This is not a bailout, this is an acquisition. And when Pakistan falls, when its 240 million people become subjects of Chinese economic authority, the shockwave will destabilize India, Afghanistan, Iran, and every nation that borders the newest addition to Beijing's empire. Here's what they're not telling you. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was announced in 2015 as a game-changing infrastructure partnership. The numbers sounded transformative. $62 billion in Chinese investment, building roads, railways, power plants, and the deep-water port at Gwadar. The investment was never investment. It was debt. Every project was financed through loans from Chinese state banks at interest rates between 5 and 7%, rates that seemed reasonable in 2015 but became catastrophic when Pakistan's currency collapsed. A loan denominated in dollars or yuan becomes twice as expensive when the rupee loses half its value. It becomes 4 times as expensive when the rupee loses 78%. Pakistan's total external debt stands at $130 billion. Of that, approximately $62 billion is owed to Chinese entities, state banks, policy banks, and state-owned enterprises that built the CPEC projects. The debt service on Chinese obligations alone consumes 4.2 trillion rupees annually, roughly 35% of Pakistan's entire federal budget. The mathematics are unsustainable. Pakistan cannot pay. China knows Pakistan cannot pay. The Comprehensive Debt Resolution Framework is China's proposal for what happens when payment becomes impossible. At 6:30 a.m. Islamabad time on January 23rd, Pakistani Finance Minister Ishaq Dar convened an emergency cabinet meeting to review the Chinese proposal. The meeting lasted 9 hours. 3 ministers reportedly left in tears. The framework contains 4 core elements. Debt for equity conversion. $38 billion in Chinese loans converted to equity stakes in Pakistani infrastructure. China would own 70% of the Gwadar port, 60% of the Pakistan Railways network, 55% of the national power transmission grid, and majority stakes in 14 industrial zones built under CPEC. Extended lease arrangements. The Gwadar port lease extended from 40 years to 99 years. The lease terms allow China to station security personnel at the port without Pakistani government approval. The security personnel provision has no numerical limit. Resource concessions. Exclusive Chinese rights to develop copper deposits in Baluchistan's Reko-Dik region, estimated at $100 billion in value, plus preferential access to Pakistani lithium, rare earth, and chromite deposits. Governance provisions. A joint economic management committee with Chinese majority representation would oversee all CPEC assets and have approval authority over Pakistani economic policies affecting those assets. Each provision transfers sovereignty from Islamabad to Beijing. Together, they transform Pakistan from a debtor nation into a client state. At 4 p.m. Eastern on January 23rd, I spoke with a former Pakistani diplomat who served as ambassador to China. He agreed to speak anonymously because he fears for his safety if identified. What China is proposing is not debt restructuring, it is the opium wars in reverse. They are using debt as the British used gunboats, to extract concessions that no sovereign nation would grant voluntarily. I asked about alternatives. There are no alternatives. The IMF has already provided $7 billion in emergency financing, with conditions that are destroying the middle class. Saudi Arabia and UAE provided bridge loans that are now due. America offers nothing except weapons we cannot afford to operate. China is the only lender left. They know it. We know it. I asked whether Pakistan would accept the framework. What choice do we have? Default means immediate economic collapse. Acceptance means gradual colonial absorption. The cabinet is debating which death is preferable. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. CPEC was sold to Pakistan as partnership. The reality was always predation. The projects themselves reveal the strategy. The deepwater port at Gwadar serves no Pakistani economic need. Pakistan's trade doesn't require a port of that scale. But Gwadar provides China with a naval facility on the Arabian Sea, bypassing the Strait of Malacca choke point that American allies could close in a conflict. The road and rail connections from Gwadar to Xinjiang serve Chinese logistics, not Pakistani development. They create a corridor for Chinese goods to reach Middle Eastern markets while bypassing sea routes. Pakistani laborers built the infrastructure. Pakistani taxpayers finance it. Chinese commerce benefits from it. The power plants were needed. Pakistan's electricity shortfall was real. But the plants were built to Chinese specifications, using Chinese equipment, operated under contracts that guarantee Chinese companies fixed returns, regardless of whether Pakistan can afford the electricity. The capacity payments Pakistan owes to Chinese power companies total $8 billion annually, even for plants operating below capacity, because Pakistan cannot afford the fuel. Every project created dependency. Every loan created obligation. Every contract created leverage that China is now exercising. The strategic implications extend far beyond Pakistan's borders. China's acquisition of Pakistani infrastructure creates military capabilities that reshape South Asian security. Gwadar Port, under Chinese control with security personnel of unlimited number, becomes a de facto Chinese naval base on the Indian Ocean. Indian naval planners have long feared encirclement, Chinese presence in the South China Sea to the east, Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean to the west. The framework delivers exactly that encirclement. The road and rail connections to Xinjiang provide logistics for Chinese military operations in Central and South Asia. Personnel and equipment that currently must ship through the Strait of Malacca, a 3-week journey, could transit through Pakistan in 3 days. The Joint Economic Management Committee, with Chinese majority control, provides legal authority for Chinese intervention in Pakistani affairs. Economic management expands to security management when economic assets require protection. India understands these implications. At 11 p.m. New Delhi time on January 23rd, India's National Security Council convened an emergency session. The session's existence was not officially acknowledged. It was reported based on vehicle movements at South Block. The Indian calculation is straightforward. A Pakistan under Chinese effective control is more dangerous than an independent Pakistan with nuclear weapons. An independent Pakistan might bluster and occasionally support militants, but it lacks the resources for sustained confrontation. A Chinese-backed Pakistan has unlimited resources and Chinese strategic direction. Less than 90 days separate today from the point where Pakistan must either accept the framework or default. The timeline is determined by IMF tranche disbursements and Chinese loan maturities that cluster in late April. April 15th, $1.1 billion IMF tranche disbursement decision. The IMF has signaled that continued support requires Pakistan to demonstrate debt sustainability, which requires either Chinese restructuring or Chinese forgiveness. April 23rd, $2.3 billion in Chinese loan principal matures. Without rollover or restructuring, Pakistan must pay from reserves. Current reserves, $8.4 billion. Paying the maturity would leave insufficient reserves to cover essential imports. April 30th, quarterly payment on power sector capacity obligations. Amount due, $2.1 billion. Non-payment triggers contract provisions allowing Chinese operators to suspend electricity generation. The dates create cascading pressure. Each deadline makes the next deadline more binding. By late April, Pakistan faces simultaneous defaults on IMF conditions, Chinese loans, and domestic power supply. The framework is designed to be accepted under exactly this pressure. China didn't create the crisis. Pakistan's governance failures created the crisis. But China positioned itself to exploit the crisis when it arrived. When nations fall into debt traps, the regional consequences cascade. Sri Lanka provides the template. In 2017, Sri Lanka couldn't service Chinese debt from Hambantota port construction. China converted the debt to a 99-year lease, the same structure now proposed for Gwadar. The lease gave China a strategic facility in the Indian Ocean. Sri Lankan sovereignty was permanently diminished. But Sri Lanka is 22 million people on an island with limited regional significance. Pakistan is 240 million people, nuclear armed, bordering India, Afghanistan, Iran, and China. The stakes are categorically different. Pakistani destabilization creates refugee flows. The 1947 partition produced 14 million refugees. A Pakistani economic collapse could produce flows of similar magnitude toward India, toward Iran, toward Afghanistan, which cannot absorb them, toward the Gulf states, which will not accept them. Pakistani destabilization empowers extremist movements. The Pakistani state, however flawed, suppresses groups that would otherwise operate freely. State collapse creates ungoverned spaces. Those spaces fill with actors whose goals extend beyond Pakistan's borders. Pakistani destabilization creates nuclear security risks. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, estimated at 170 warheads, is secured by state institutions. Institutional collapse creates custody questions that every nuclear security analyst has nightmared about for decades. The Chinese framework doesn't intend to collapse Pakistan. It intends to control Pakistan. But the control mechanisms themselves create instability. Pakistani nationalism, already inflamed by IMF conditions, will react to Chinese ownership of national infrastructure. Baluch separatists, already fighting Pakistani control of Baluchistan, will find new grievances in Chinese extraction of Baluch resources. Religious movements will frame Chinese presence as infidel colonization. The framework assumes Pakistan can be pacified through economic management. Pakistan's history suggests otherwise. At 9 a.m. Beijing time on January 24th, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs held a press conference addressing the framework reports. Spokesperson Lin Jin called the reports speculation based on incomplete information and characterized CPEC as a model of South-South cooperation that benefits both nations. The denial is standard. China denied similar intentions in Sri Lanka until the Hambantota lease was signed. They denied similar intentions in Zambia until Zambian power infrastructure fell under Chinese operational control. The pattern is consistent. Deny until the deal is done, then present the outcome as mutual benefit. The benefit is not mutual. China gains strategic infrastructure, resource access, and regional influence. Pakistan gains continued survival in a debt trap, survival that requires ever deeper Chinese control. What the informed understand is that Pakistan's crisis is not unique. It's the leading edge of a debt trap affecting dozens of nations that borrowed from China during the Belt and Road lending spree. Zambia has already restructured under Chinese terms. Sri Lanka has already surrendered strategic assets. Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Laos, Cambodia, each carries Chinese debt that exceeds their capacity to repay. The total Belt and Road lending portfolio, approximately $1.3 trillion across 150 countries. The portion that will require restructuring based on current default trajectories, $400 to $600 billion. Each restructuring follows the same pattern: convert debt to equity, extend leases to near perpetual terms, secure resource concessions, establish governance mechanisms that subordinate local authority to Chinese oversight. The pattern is not colonialism in the 19th century sense. No governors general, no direct administration. It's something more sophisticated. Economic sovereignty transferred through contracts that debtor nations sign voluntarily because the alternative is immediate collapse. Pakistan is the largest domino. When Pakistan falls, when the framework is signed and Chinese control becomes explicit, the remaining dominoes understand their future. Accept Chinese terms or face Pakistani consequences. The Pakistani rupee weighs less than a gram. The paper costs more to print than the currency is worth in most transactions. Children in Karachi use bundles of small denomination notes as toys because the notes have no practical value as money. The rupee's collapse is not natural disaster. It's the arithmetic consequence of debt that cannot be serviced, deficits that cannot be closed, and obligations that grow faster than the economy. Jinnah's face on the note represents a nation founded on the promise of independence. Independence from British rule, independence from Indian domination, independence to chart Pakistan's own course. That independence is being sold, clause by clause, in a 234-page document that trades sovereignty for solvency. The framework will probably be signed. The alternatives are worse from the cabinet's perspective: immediate collapse versus gradual absorption. The decision is rational given the constraint, but the constraints were created by decisions made over decades. Borrowing without capacity to repay, building infrastructure that served lenders rather than borrowers, accepting terms that looked manageable in good times and became catastrophic in bad times. Every nation considering Chinese loans should study the Pakistani framework. The belt is not a road to prosperity. It's a conveyor belt to Beijing's strategic portfolio. $62 billion, 234 pages, 90 days until signature. The numbers describe the acquisition of a nuclear-armed nation of 240 million people. The acquisition is not hostile. There are no troops. There are no threats. There are only loans that cannot be repaid, and a framework that converts loans into control. When historians write about the 21st century's great power competition, they may identify this week, the week the Pakistani framework was delivered, as the moment China's sphere of influence expanded to the Arabian Sea. Not through war, through contracts. The rupee is still falling, the framework is still on the table, and Pakistan's 240 million people are still waiting to learn who will own their country by summer. The answer is being negotiated in Islamabad and Beijing. The answer does not include them. $62 billion, that's the price of a nation. Payment is due in 90 days.